Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Greetings and thanks for joining us for another session of In the Word. We're following along a series of 5 lessons on the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew, and we're enjoying these important lessons from the ethical teachings of Jesus. Dr. Roberts and I have been happy to be in Matthew for a little while here, and in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. We start in chapter 5 where the sermon begins, and we had the beautiful Beatitudes, which emphasize the character traits of a kingdom person, and then moved on to salt and light.
Yes.
And then the rest of chapter 5 talks about Christian ethical behavior kind of in relationship to the law, to the Mosaic law.
And especially law as it was being taught to the people, and that's where Jesus was drawing the contrast of, you've heard it said, but I say to you.
Yeah. So that you heard it said is not so much a reference back to the initial giving of the law under Moses, but what?
It's the way it was being taught by the Pharisees and the scribes, or teachers of the law at the time. And as we've said, it was an effort to minimize some of the requirements and to maximize some of the exceptions or concessions.
That was the approach that the Pharisees
were taking.
And so Jesus wants to engage the law and affirm it, but also engage the teachings of the teachers of the law of his day and correct some of what he was hearing there that might have been confusing to the people. We've already seen a number of the topics that he dealt with. Jesus talked about the forbidding of murder in the context of a larger forbidding of any kinds of violence, emotional, verbal violence. And then we moved on to adultery, which he put in the context of sexual immorality in general, lust and things like that. Then he spent some time on the topic of divorce, which was dealt with in the law. And he said, maybe we shouldn't just focus on the exceptions to it. We should take seriously why God hates divorce.
The covenant commitment that should be involved.
Now, we're skipping one of the topics that he dealt with there in our chapter 5 of Matthew, and that is the business of oath-taking. And he says, you'll hear the teachers of the law say that you can swear on important things like Jerusalem or
the
something
altar,
like that.
What's on the altar.
Swear by things, and his teaching there is just be truthful, and you won't have to swear on anything.
Let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yeah, so Jesus kind of eliminates the need for swearing. And I mean, I can remember as a kid, people would swear on a stack of Bibles or swear on my mother's grave or whatever. We find all these things to swear on, and Jesus says, maybe just forget the oath-taking and tell the truth. Speak the truth. So our lessons don't deal directly with that one, but we thought we'd mention it. We come to the last 2 today. So what are our topics for today?
Well, the 2 today are the retaliation, the eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and then the question about how you deal with your enemies.
Yeah, as well as your neighbors.
Right.
And the enemies among your neighbors. So 2 very important teachings from the law that Jesus reiterates, in fact, reiterated on a number of occasions, the second one. So, let's read the latter part of chapter 5 then. I'll start in verse 38.
Okay.
You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, there's some striking teachings in this section here that we're going to need to think about. Pretty striking. Now, is this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth actually in the Old Testament?
Yes.
That's a law.
And it was a very common perception in the Middle East. The old Code of Hammurabi brought up the lex talionis, it's called, the law of retaliation.
Yeah.
But the intention of it was to limit what people would do, so that if somebody hits you, you don't kill them.
Right.
If they do something, you're allowed to do that much, but no more. And the law of the Old Testament incorporates that more than once.
Yeah. And yes, it appears in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, so it gets repeated there. And it's longer than eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's just kind of the abbreviation. Yeah. It ends with life for a life.
Yeah.
But you're right, and that's important to realize that the original intention of this law was to mitigate against the tendency to retaliate more than the original offense was.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember going down the hall in junior high or middle school, somebody would bump into somebody, and then they didn't like that, so they would turn around and push them against the lockers or something, and then they would come over and hit them, and pretty soon you have a brawl going on, because you always want to do a little more than that. And so this law was
we see that with nations today.
Yeah. Where
one slight is given and some kind of retaliation is in multiple is returned.
And then it can lead to world war.
Yes.
I mean, as we've seen in our history. So that's the purpose. Now, the problem was that even in Jesus' day, what was intended to limit retaliation had kind of become an excuse for or an encouragement to retaliation.
Right.
There's nothing in the law of retaliation that says you have to sock somebody in the eye if they sock you in the eye. It just says you can't do any more than that. But this had become, and I think even today, it's somehow used as an excuse for retaliation.
And some of us, I can remember being taught as a kid, you don't do the first blow. If somebody hits you, that's the time to hit them back.
You better get them back. Okay, well that's kind of built into our ethical system, and Jesus runs counter to that in his teaching here, because when he corrects this common teaching, he says, do not resist the evil person.
Yeah.
So Jesus' teaching kind of mitigates against this quick rush to self-defense and retaliation that seems to be kind of built into our psyches so much.
And people will bring up exceptions. Well, what about police? And what about your military? You know, you've got to have a defense force for your country. And he's not talking about that. He's not talking in either case. And the Old Testament law set up regulations as far as taking care of criminals and so forth. But this is in personal relationships.
Interpersonal relations. That's a good reminder that Christians should not do their ethical understanding based on exceptions.
Right.
You know, if somebody says, well, Jesus says, do not resist an evil person, we shouldn't just immediately jump and say, well, what about war? Or, what about incarcerating criminals or something? Well, don't jump to the exception first. First, take seriously the teaching of Jesus and think, now, how can I apply this to the road rage I feel when somebody cuts me off in traffic? What do I do with the immediate desire I have welling up in me to speed up and cut them off.
Yeah.
Just to show them they can't do it.
It's a natural response.
Yeah, we need to apply this very practically to the daily inner relationships of our lives, and that's what Jesus was really focused on.
And I had read.
Not, by the way, not that I would ever do that.
Right. One commentary was saying that Jesus is teaching not the irresponsibility which encourages evil, but the forbearance which renounces revenge. And that's really what he was dealing with.
Yeah.
The tendency to revenge and make sure that you got in your blow.
Yeah.
And that's
well put. I like that. He gives several examples which may seem a little extreme or unlikely to us, but I think it's helpful to remember that Jesus frequently illustrated these teachings with slightly hyperbolic examples. So I don't know if these are likely to have occurred in his day or not. But this business about slapping on the right cheek is kind of interesting. If you really wanted to insult a person, you would slap them with the back of your left hand, and that would, in fact, land on a person's right cheek.
Yeah.
Because the left hand was the filthy hand,
the dirty hand,
the dirty hand,
Yeah.
and the back of the hand was always considered more insulting than the palm. So that appears to be what he's picturing here with slapped on the right cheek.
Yeah. And suing and taking your tunic, not really your shirt, but we don't dress quite the way they did.
Yeah.
But it was your close garment,
and it was an underrobe.
Right.
Yeah. So it wasn't like a shirt the way we have it. It was more like a very long T-shirt.
Yeah.
A lightweight.
Kind of thing. Yeah.
A lightweight underrobe.
Yeah.
Now, what about the word coat here?
Well, in the Old Testament, people were forbidden for debts to take someone's coat because that was their necessary means of warmth.
Yeah.
And that was the limit. You don't take a coat. Jesus is saying, if somebody takes your overshirt, give them your coat.
Yeah. The law couldn't take your cloak away from you, but you could voluntarily give it to someone that you thought might need it more than you did. Yeah. So this is the cloak or mantle, not like a button-up coat like we have, but a cloak or a mantle. The third example that's given is in verse 41, this business of walking, forcing you to go 1 mile.
And apparently the Roman soldiers would requisition people to carry their pack, but there was a limit of 1 mile. And Jesus is saying, if you're forced to go 1 mile, go the 2nd mile.
Yeah, and that's become a proverbial saying in our language, hasn't it, to go the 2nd mile. And, Jesus, growing up in Galilee and Nazareth there, where Roman soldiers patrolled regularly, may well have seen this as a young man coming through town, and a Roman soldier stops at the well to get a drink and throws his pack into the chest of a teenage boy and says, I'm on my way to Cana. You take this the next mile.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, if that happens, surprise him. Carry it.
Yeah.
So that's been interesting. Now, by the time we get to verse 42, we see that this teaching about non-retaliation, which is very pointed and very clear, evolves kind of into a teaching about an attitude of generosity and giving toward others, right?
Yes. So it's not just a response, it's taking the initiative.
Yeah. If there's any kind of request, then give. Be cooperative. If there's a need to borrow, and again we're in financial categories here, then don't turn that person away.
And a lot of people nowadays will question, should I give money because it may be used for bad things? But I've known a number of people who carry gift cards to restaurants and give those, or take the person to the restaurant and buy them lunch and sit down and talk with them and get to know them. And sometimes it's not what they want. They want the cash.
That's true.
But if there really is a need, you may find out there's a person behind that need that you can get to know.
And hopefully, that even if the gift card to McDonald's wasn't exactly what they wanted, the generosity, your generous Christian spirit will shine through eventually, and you've probably given them what they need, even if you haven't given them what they want.
Yeah.
So there are ways, rather than again just say, well, just raise the excuse. I'm not going to give them money because they'll just go around the corner to the liquor store or something like that. We don't want our morality, our ethics to be controlled by exceptions.
Right.
We look for ways to proactively benefit people and do good and be kind.
Yeah, and this thing of borrowing, we both experienced the point of saying, if somebody is wanting to borrow, if it's at all possible, instead of making a loan, make it a gift.
Yeah, so that it doesn't come with strings attached or repayment attached.
Or destroy the relationship because of repayment.
And there may be situations in which repayment is natural and necessary. But I think you're right. Whenever possible, have it be a gift. Well, this is a fascinating teaching here about non-retaliation, and in the world in which we live, where self-defense has become glorified from a personal level to international politics, we need to think very carefully about the ways in which we can incorporate an attitude of non-retaliation, non-vengeful behavior into our daily lives and our interrelationships. Including the way I drive through Philadelphia.
Right.
All right. The second one, and the last of the examples that Jesus gives from the law, has to do with a law. This is in the law, love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
But when he starts, you have heard that it was said, as you've been reminding us, this is not what's recorded in the law. This is what was being taught by the teachers of the law in Jesus' day.
And it really shows up here.
Yeah, explain to us what's going on here.
They had quoted and taught what's in the Old Testament, love your neighbor, but they added, and hate your enemy. That's not in the Old Testament. No. God doesn't ever command us to hate our enemy.
Right. Now, the teaching to love your neighbor is clearly in Leviticus 19:18. It couldn't be any clearer.
Yeah. And constantly in Jesus' teaching.
Yes, it's all over the teaching of Jesus and shows up in several places throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Maybe let's name some of the important places where love your neighbor as yourself shows up. In Jesus' teaching to the rich young ruler, it's there.
Yeah.
In Jesus' conversation with the scribe.
Questioner about what's the greatest commandment.
Yes, greatest commandment.
Good Samaritan story.
Okay, Good Samaritan story. So those are really important places, aren't they? And then it shows up twice in the writings of Paul, in Romans and in Galatians, and in James as well.
It's the royal law.
I looked those three places up, and it was interesting. In Romans, Paul says, love your neighbor as yourself is the full law. The fulfillment of the law is found in that. And then in Galatians 5, he says, this is the whole law. Again, similar, just a slightly different word. And James takes a slightly different approach. He says, this is the royal law. This is the law of the king. Love your neighbor as yourself. So there's no question that love your neighbor as yourself had a prominent place in the Mosaic Law, in Leviticus, and if possible, even more prominent place in the teaching of Jesus and his followers. Now, what about hate your enemy? Is there anything, you said that's not in the Old Testament?
No, you've got situations where there were enemies and there were wars, but never does God command people to hate an enemy.
in terms of interpersonal relations.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, we see just the contrary. We see commandments to love the alien, the foreigner who's passing through your land, and to care for.
You once were aliens, and you respect those who are.
And we see some then concrete examples of this, like in the story of Ruth, where she is an alien. We're going to have some lessons from Ruth coming up soon here, and we'll see. The Moabites were the arch enemies of the Jews, and yet she's treated with kindness. So this hate your enemy is an addition to the law and a real twisting of the intentions of God in the law that are here. And Jesus corrects it very directly in verse 44. But I tell you, love your enemies, not hate. It's just as contrary as possible. And pray for those who persecute you.
And there's really a progression in the teaching of Jesus from don't resist one who is evil to love your enemies. So it's not only not resisting, it's taking that step forward to love those.
That is so important. In other words, the ethical teaching here is not just don't do the bad thing or don't do the wrong thing. It's proactively do the right thing. In moving from verse 39, do not resist an evil person, to verse 44, love your enemies.
Yeah.
That's a great insight.
And one of the things that will come up still in the Sermon on the Mount, 7th chapter, is what we call the golden rule, to do unto others what you'd have them do unto you. I read someplace that in almost all the major religions, there's a commandment, don't do anything to somebody that they haven't done to you. But only in Jesus do you find him taking the initiative to do what you'd like them to do to you.
Right. So that golden rule was formulated in the negative in many religions.
Right.
Including in the teachings of the Jewish rabbis, I think.
Yeah.
But only Jesus sees it as a positive, proactive thing of doing good to others, not just avoiding the evil.
Right.
That's an interesting parallel. Verse 45 of Matthew 5 gives us the reason for loving our enemies, and it's an interesting one.
It is.
We don't love our enemies just for self-protection or so they won't retaliate worse or something like that. It's so that you may be children of your Father. What's going on there?
The family connection here is the strong emphasis that Jesus is making. And both of these and all of what he's saying here has to do with relationships with people. And it's based on the relationship we have with God.
Yeah. And Jesus often made that connection in his teaching, because whenever he was asked what's the greatest commandment, he would always start with our relationship with God. Love the Lord your God. But then he always linked that with our relationship with one another, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And here he doesn't say it in those terms, but we see that the dynamic holds. The way in which we relate to one another is directly connected to the way in which we relate to God. The other thing that's going on here with this children of your Father is this phrase, children of, or child of, or sons of, which implies character traits.
You've inherited something.
Yes. So when Jesus called James and John the sons of thunder, he meant you're like thunder. You're loud and, blow off your top.
Yeah, the characteristics and genetics.
Or when Paul uses the phrase children of wrath, he meant you're characterized by a wrathful disposition. And so here, children of your Father is a way of saying like God.
Yeah.
If you want to love your neighbor, you need to love your neighbor because that's the way God is.
And we'll see that in the last verse here. As we look
Exactly, yeah. And it always reminds me of those, 3 times Paul says things like, while we were yet sinners, or while we were still the enemies of God, God sent his son to die for us. So loving enemies is acting like God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the latter part of verse 45 sure changes my way of thinking about things. It says that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and good and sends rain, beneficial rain, on the righteous and unrighteous. I kind of still am tempted to buy into the old notion that God rewards good people with good things and sends bad things to bad people, right?
We preached 3 years in a little rural area, and people would talk about when they got too wet, or whatever, the crops weren't getting the right moisture or something. Guess you haven't paid the preacher. Because the God's punishing you.
God's punishing you. Yeah. Well, this sets that notion kind of on its head here.
Right.
That God seeks to bless all people, even if they're doing evil. So that may change the way we think about things. There is an interesting passage in the Old Testament which suggests this love for enemies that Jesus is emphasizing here. It's in Proverbs chapter 25, verse 21. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. If they're thirsty, give them water to drink. So the idea there, and then it goes on, you don't need to worry about them rewarding you. Don't do it so your enemies reward you, because the Lord will reward you. And that's actually what Jesus says. He may have been thinking of that verse in Proverbs.
Verse 46.
Yeah, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Well, it's not a matter of humans rewarding you for your goodness.
Yeah.
God's got that part covered. Well, let's look at 48, because it's an interesting verse. You say it is saying pretty much the same thing as this children of your Father. Right?
It's be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay, so he says our the challenge to ethical living as kingdom people is really part and parcel of being like God, which we are created to be.
Yeah, and he's not saying that we've got to reach moral perfection.
Right.
It's a word that indicates the completion or fullness or
maturity.
Yeah.
And notice that Jesus says these words, be ye perfect. Well, there's the King James popping back into my head. Be perfect. Specifically in this context, it's not our ethical lives in general that he's talking about, like you say, some kind of general moral perfection, but it's specifically in this area of loving enemies. God is like, that's what God is like. He loved us while we were still sinners.
Yeah.
And so we need to do everything we can to be like God in the area of loving people who are opposed to us.
And it's interesting, in Leviticus several times, it's be holy for God is holy, and it draws them back to the fact that God brought them out of Egypt, and that's the basis. Here, Jesus is saying, be perfect as your Father is perfect. So it's not a historical basis, it's a family relationship.
It's a relational, yeah. That's good. Well, Jesus has given us two really strong challenges in these teachings, and I hope that we can resolve to not excuse them or find exceptions to them, but to really take them seriously in our daily lives as we relate to one another in the Lord. Thanks so much for listening in on our conversation today. I hope you'll be with us again next time. See you then.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.